Welcome to the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Dame, holistic nutrition coach and speaker. Let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode here on the Beyond Sugar Freedom podcast. I'm so excited for another incredible interview and guest. We have Kyira here with us today. How are you doing, Kyira?
I'm so good. I'm really, really pumped to be here.
Good. I know you and I were just talking before I hit record that we're both in this situation where the rain has finally come. The rain is finally here, and we're both on the West Coast, different countries, but same zone. And the sun has been gifting us its presence for a long time, longer than normal. And now we're officially into fall, and the rain is coming.
And it feels like, even though we know it should be coming, I mean, it feels like weather is a thing that we'll always talk about, no matter how mundane we think it is, because it's like, I still feel like I got blindsided, even though it's almost the end of October and we should have had rain. We should have had cold before now. Yeah. But I woke up this morning putting my kid in like her full rain suit. And she's like, I want mittens. I want a hat. I'm like, oh, it's here. And I'm like, I don't even want to go outside. I don't want to get in the car. I just want to snuggle up. So yeah, it blindsided me. And at the same time, we need it. I'm glad it's here.
Yeah, me too. We do need it. And it gives us a chance to shift, obviously, into, this beautiful time of season as well. And getting cozy and soup and scarves. And we have a sauna, which is a savior in the winter.
Us too. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So, yep, I 100% love it.
Okay, to the sauna. When we're done this episode, we're going to get out into the sauna in the rain. Okay, so I'm really, really excited to dive in today because we're going to be talking about some really big things and some really important things. And I know both of us are probably going to be sharing some very personal stories and some things that are really coming up. And I think I'm really grateful for you being here, Kyira, because we haven't talked about this on the podcast yet. And we're gonna dive really deep into this. But before we do, for those who aren't familiar with you, I did share a little bit about you in the intro to this episode. But can you share a little bit more about who you are and your journey and your story that got you into, obviously helping people in such a powerful way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, whenever I go to do this, I always feel like I could give what I think is going to be the short version, but it ends up being the longer version. So I'm trying really hard to do the condensed one that we can kind of dive in. But basically, I'm a licensed mental health therapist. I got into therapy, I think, very indirectly, and yet it was like in front of me all along. So I grew up, my mom struggled with undiagnosed mental health diagnoses, predominantly bipolar disorder and a really severe cocaine addiction and other substances. And for the first part of my life, she had been sober. She was around. She was actually not supposed to have kids. And so having me was kind of like the shock to her system to get sober for quite a while. And then there's a difference in just sort of couching addiction and couching pain versus moving through it. And so I think when I was about 9 or 10, she'd kind of been pushing it off to the side, and it came back and I think reverberated and slapped her in the face. And so that was kind of the start of her journey through some really painful things that then affected me. And so moving in and out of different family members' homes, her being in and out of substance use kind of rehabilitation places, jail, prison. I was meant to go for like 6 months or a year and live with other people. And then it ended up being, I never moved back in with her. And so that was, again, I think I left my house just after I turned 11. And during that time, kind of all through growing up, my mom was a nurse. And so I was in the health field, and she worked a lot with people. She was in the hospice and cancer area. And so this was also, she was a nurse during more of the height of the AIDS epidemic. So she worked there was a lot of times in the hospice unit, there were people that were dying of AIDS as well. And so I was around a lot of really painful experiences for families and for patients. And I was always enjoying going in and talking to people, just kind of bringing some light, hearing their stories, having them feel seen. But I think because I was like, oh, well, this is medical, for a long time I wanted to be a doctor. That kind of long story long did not work out, and it was a wonderful thing that it didn't. I think I didn't realize it until much later in the process than sometimes my shame, which we'll get to, would have wanted me to. But what I always wanted to do was to work somehow in the field of mental health, and what I wanted is for people's stories to be heard and for them to be able to kind of have the power to not get stuck in them. And to realize that, I think as I moved forward, so much of my life, it felt like was happening to me. And it did. There's a lot of things that happened to me that I couldn't control, that I still can't control no matter how much I want to. But really helping them realign with and recenter on a sense of power and control that is supportive and additive, and then helping the brain kind of work through these things. And so I dipped around during that time. I developed what I didn't know until I was in my 30s actually was pretty severe PTSD and some pretty chronic anxiety. And I would say the forefront of my diagnoses was a pretty bad eating disorder. And so I was in touch with body stuff, in touch with mental health things. And then I was in line with that, working in different mental health places. I actually managed a gym, and I did a lot of work around mindset around there, worked for a grassroots mental health organization, and kind of through my own healing and then these different pockets and conversations realized I wanted to be in the therapy room. I wanted to be a person on the other side of those conversations that was actually listening and wanting to help someone write their own story, versus what I experienced growing up, which was a lot of people telling me what my story was and what healing needed to look like and imposing that on me. And so, yeah, again, long story long, as one of my clients likes to say, but that's kind of how I got to where I am. Is I think that weaving of not feeling heard, not feeling seen, feeling like a lot of stuff was stuffed down because my family doesn't know how to deal with emotions, because I didn't know how to deal with emotions. I was, 10 when it started happening, but also not having the supports that I necessarily needed, even in the professional realm. And so seeing that, but then also just being really interested in this idea of we're all looking for connection. We're all looking to feel heard. And whether you are dying in the hospital and this is happening, or you are, alone in the middle of a pandemic and you just went through a loss, or life just feels hard, like people just need to feel heard and figure out how to kind of take the pen back and write the story they want to live.
Yeah. Wow. That's so powerful on so many levels, Kyira. And, I'm just learning a lot of this to your story, and it's just so, incredible to see how you chose to come out of this, right? And how you chose to, no matter what unfolded for you, right, in childhood, which no doubt was very traumatic, just seeing, your ability. And I think this is just really important to point out for everybody listening, right? Like, no matter what our story was in childhood, or, even from yesterday backwards,
even
right?
this morning, 5 minutes ago,
2 minutes ago when you started listening to this podcast, right? And I think that's such a beautiful way of wording it, Kyira, and really understanding that we do in any given moment have the ability and choice to rewrite our story, right? And to honor that, like, there are things that happen to us that we can't change, that we're just fact, but we can change how we relate to it and what we tell ourselves about it, and what it means about us, right? Our beliefs, our story. And that's just so powerful, and how that can actually change our whole world. Like, I know a lot of my clients, right? Obviously we talk about sugar and sugar addiction, and everyone listening, right? This is what you're here for. And even that, and even our food story, right? And how we think about ourselves and what we say about ourselves, can in any given moment, we can choose a different way of being. And it often doesn't feel like a choice, though. That's the thing, like, sometimes it just feels like this is just my life and I have no way out of it, right? What would you say to someone who maybe is in that space, because I know I've been there times in my life too, that, back before I understood my power, was like, well, this is just what it is. This is just what I have to do. This is the other people's definition of success. This is what I do to be a good member of society. And, this is how I lose weight, starve myself, and then we're good to go. Right. Like, how do we flip that switch, right? To really understanding that it is a choice.
I love that. And I love the sort of way of thinking about how, so there's something called the drama triangle, and it's talked about a lot in terms of interpersonal relationships and dynamics. And it kind of got popularized, and it's been talked about a lot more as it relates to codependency and these other kind of hot ticket words, narcissism, things like that in the public right now. But I really like to think about the drama triangle as it relates to our inner dialogue and shame. So the drama triangle is basically that when we get stuck in our shame, we will pick and play, and we'll kind of ebb and flow between one of three roles. So there's the hero, which isn't I am the hero. It's I have to do and be it all for everybody at all times. I have to be the one with the answer. I have to be the yes person. I have to be the one that can do all this to be okay. There's the villain, which says every time something goes wrong, it's my fault. I'm the problem. I did this. And then there's the victim. And the victim is sort of in opposition to these other two that says, I have no power, no control. Everything happens to me. I throw my hands up at it all. No matter what I do, I can't win. People aren't there for me. The world is terrible. Well, what you're describing in terms of our relationship with food, with sugar, with our any sort of addiction, whether it's technology addiction, the sort of self-hatred addiction that we all have right now, whatever it is, we tend to start to fall in those different categories when it comes to how we think and feel about ourselves in that. So either I have all the control, everything's fine, it's not a big deal, or I have no control, things just keep happening. I can't control myself with sugar. I can't do these things. And these stories become our truths. So they're a thought that we just repeat over and over and over again. And so we start to believe, and we wire the brain to say, like, this is what I have to do. This is how I respond. When X happens, when I feel sad, I eat sugar. When I feel mad, I eat sugar. When I feel heartbroken, I eat sugar. And we start to associate these things and we say, well, that's the only way through. And then we beat ourselves up about it the next day. We're the villain. And then we fall right back into, I have no control. I can't stop myself. And so one of the things I think about is, how do we understand these systems and understand how we're getting stuck there? Not as a way, because I think this happens a lot too, where we break it down and we say, we do have a choice. We do have control. We also know it's not as easy as waking up in the morning and saying, well, I'm never going to eat sugar again and everything's fine. Or I'm going to eat sugar and never have a problem with it. There is legitimately some physiological and psychological addiction that we have to things. And again, in this case, we're talking about sugar. That does need to be unlearned and relearned in processes that are more supportive of how we want to live. And what we do have more control over in those moments is to say, I have the choice and the power to try again. I have the ability to continue to work to write a different story. I do have control over not eating this thing in front of me right now. And I might still eat it, but that doesn't mean I don't still have control and power and the ability to come back. And so I think, to answer your thoughts and question, I think a lot of it is realizing that playing these roles and getting stuck in these narratives of feeling like we have to over control. So again, even the dieting piece, like don't eat any sugar, don't eat anything, do this, work out 10 times a day. You know, I have to articulate every single point of the process of weight loss and looking a certain way, or the I have no control. I throw my hands up, I've eaten the whole pizza, whatever it is. Realizing how all that's connected to shame, realizing that food and our relationship with food is not the problem. It's the underlying stories that is the issue, that the sugar is just the placeholder for coping. And it's maladaptive, it's unhelpful, it's not working for us, but it's our body's way of just trying to make sense of something and get through a painful emotion. And so how are we getting stuck there? And how do we see that we have control to look past the sugar? And maybe, and I say this to eating disorder clients all the time, or people that are struggling with eating disorders when we're in the therapy room, is I'm not even going to touch your meal plan. We're not going to talk about binging and purging right away. Like, sure, I can help you stop purging. I can help you stop binging. I can help you stop, like, cut off the behavior. But if we don't deal with everything underneath, all we're doing is like putting a giant Band-Aid over a volcano, hoping it's not going to erupt again. And it's either going to erupt again in our face, or it's going to find a new outlet. And now maybe you're not purging, but you're self-harming in a different way, or you're engaging with something else. So I know that's a long answer, but I think that's the piece, is like, it's not as simple as we tend to tell ourselves it is, because we use that simplicity to judge ourselves. And the work is simpler than we tell ourselves if we focus on the zones and areas we have control over. Yeah, no, that's really, really powerful. And I couldn't agree with you more. I've seen a lot in my practice is like, this has nothing to do with food. Exactly that. It's just the outlet, right? And when I first started 6 years ago, that's what I did, right? Was the meal plans and the let's detox from sugar. And I very quickly realized, like, that's not the root of what's really going on here. So I very much get that. And I know everybody listening, you know, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you get this too, right? It's this inner piece, and it is just that outlet, right? And for a lot of you listening, it just happens to be sugar, but for someone else, it could be cocaine or alcohol, or it is these escapism mechanisms. So we've kind of been dancing a little bit around shame here, but let's hit the nail on the head a little bit for those who, you know, aren't familiar. Maybe this is a new conversation. And even for me, because I love hearing, you know, different angles and ideas. And there's, as I was sharing with you before we hit record, you know, I'm noticing and recognizing some shame coming up and different areas that I'm still growing and learning. So what is shame, and where does it come from? I feel like we need to kind of start there, and then we'll go deeper from there. Yeah. So shame, my conceptualization of it is that shame is an emotion. It's a fear-based response that comes up anytime we perceive or experience a threat to connection or belonging. And so it's rooted in the aspects that we need connection to others to survive, not to thrive, to, at our baseline, survive. And so our bodies, from the time that we're born as infants, we are trying to figure out the ways to be connected, to get our needs met, to stay with people. You know, little babies, all they maybe know how to do is to cry or to like kind of scream out because we're just saying like, I need something, please come here. And then as we get older, we are still trying to figure out, okay, so how do I maintain my sense of value, my sense of worth, my sense of belonging in the world? And what ends up happening is, I mean, wherever people live in the world, but in particular in more individualistic cultures. So cultures kind of, you know, I'm in the US. So cultures where it's kind of this idea of get to the top, the independence, everybody can succeed and drive and move forward, and ambition and motivation and hustle culture. It is this idea that there is a ladder system, and some people will be better or worse or be more worthy of connection and belonging. And so what we do is we see, well, you know, let's just call out systems of oppression. Men are, you know, better than women. You know, Black people are less important than white people. All these things that we internalize as biases because of the cultures that we live in. So then we start to say, wait, well, I was born female, or I identify gender non-binary, or I'm not white. What does that mean about me? So there's a baseline we start to assume about the world. And then it goes even deeper. It's, well, if I'm Black, if I'm a woman, one of the only ways to make up for that is to have a certain level of success, a certain level of grades, be in a certain body type, look a certain way. So what ends up happening is all of these rules and ladders that get put on us because we live in systems that say some people are better or worse. And again, whether somebody actively believes that or not, there's a degree of needing to admit it's a cultural thing that we live in. Again, whether someone says, well, I don't think that way, that's not what we're talking about. We're saying that on a subconscious level, we are wired as sort of this hierarchical culture and community. And then we see on top of that, okay, well, that person in the smaller body gets treated different than that person in a bigger body. That person that is louder gets treated differently than that person who is quieter and goes with the flow. That person with the A's gets treated differently than that person with the D. Or the person that wears the preppy clothes in high school gets treated differently than the person that's wearing all black and is painting their nails and doesn't talk. And so all of that creates rules that say, well, if you want to be connected, if you want to be worthy, you aren't as you are. So look at the rules and the systems around you and figure out how you're going to make up for that. And in our case, what that is then acting and looking a certain way to be perceived in a way that then is worthy of connection and belonging. And every time we don't, or we think we're at risk, that's when we feel shame. You're supposed to be in control of your food and then you didn't and you binged on sugar. Now you feel shame and you're out of control and you hide it. You don't want to tell anybody about it because you need to protect people from seeing the ways that you're quote unquote failing in the process.
Yeah. Wow. You explained that really well. I love that way of understanding it and explaining. It's so deep, and it's so, you know, it's also one of those things, and that's why I'm so glad we're, you know, taking the lid off of this, because we all have shame at some level.
Yes.
I know I struggle with my body shame and emotional shame and the eating shame. I mean, this is where one of the biggest cues, right, for anyone with addictive patterning is that hiding. Right. Mm-hmm. There's like, and that was my mom. She always had the hidden candy drawer, right? Yep. There was such like shame around food and her addiction to sugar. And I adopted that, right? I went right into that as well, like hiding my snacks. And I know a lot of you listening as well, kind of coming at that. And I love, like, I think it was Gabor Mate I was listening to, and I love obviously his work around addiction and understanding that shame is really at the root of this. Is this like biggest trauma that most of us, he says, right, that have at a young age, is this loss of our true selves, our loss of identity, right? This, exactly like you said, right? We learn like, okay, this is how the world works and who's at the top of the hierarchy and how I fit in, right? It's this drive to fit in, you know, that so many of us are still in the people pleasing tendencies and like trying to, you know, get to the top, right? And get that status or get that sense of enoughness. Right. That isn't an external thing. That's all internal, right? Well, that's not what we're taught. And yeah, it's makes so much sense the way you describe that, right? Around like, here's this vision of what I should look like or act like or be like, and I'm not that, so there must be something wrong with me. And then internalizing that, you know, turning into this deep shame that then, you know, we feel so deeply that the pain of that then we're, you know, using these things that happen to be sugar, right, to escape from that pain and to kind of overcome that. And it's it's deep and it's tricky and it's so important just to acknowledge. So I'm grateful for you, you know, sharing that. What has been your experience in like in this shame? You know, I think we've been talking about it a little bit, but more specifically in like how shame shows up in how we actually connect with our body, right? And how we actually connect to food and, you know, this disordered eating. Like, what did you notice in your experience and even in your practice with clients? You know, how does that actually show up? And, you know, how is that something that, you know, essentially everybody listening, right? We need to look at this, right? This is a big area, right? It's not the food. This is the real root that we're talking about here. So how have you noticed that showing up, you know, around body image and around the actual like eating habits and patterns with people?
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting, honestly. So I've been in my own recovery for over 10 years. I've been working as a therapist now and working in relation to mental health for, I think I've actively been a therapist for 5 years, plus like work prior to that. So I've done a lot of work. And on the eating disorder level, I've worked at partial hospitalization, intensive outpatient, group therapy. Like I have run the gamut. And I honestly think the best sort of and most humbling educator on how this all comes to be has been having my daughter 2.5 years ago. Because what I'm seeing is, and so one thing I want to go back to that you were describing, and just to kind of like hit it even deeper is, we aren't also saying that then, you know, somebody that is born with these sort of like power up sort of identities or intersecting identities don't face this either. I think you said it perfectly that everybody experiences shame. And the shame is either I'm the underdog and have to figure out a way to have value in the room, or the only way that I have value is if I stay on top. And so there's this piece that all of us are playing, and it's all rooted to external validation and systems of feeling like we are of value instead of existing in places and spaces where we cultivate that sense of internal peace and realizing that if everybody in the world didn't like me, but I was living in line with my values, I was trying to be a good person, I was doing the things that were important to me because they were values to me, I would be okay. I would be worthy. I would be deserving of love. And so when we talk about food, when we talk about our bodies, I think one of the biggest things is, I mean, I see this, again, I have these conversations with my mom who is just here visiting, my mother-in-law who's here helping us with our daughter right now, all of my family, honestly, friends of ours that do or don't have kids, even other people in the field, where the way we talk about kids, the way we talk about food, the way we talk about emotions, there's sort of this intergenerational transmission of a lack of talking about things and polarizing things. So if she eats a certain way, she's a good eater, you know, or even I just got rid of a book she got at a doctor's office that said, well, if she's a good girl, her mom lets her have a bite of blank. And it's like, well, food isn't good or bad. And food is not something that we use to respond to feeling good or bad. But also things like talking about bodies and talking about, you know, whether it's their hair, whether it's their skin, whether it's how fast they're growing, how much they weigh. Like there's so much emphasis on these elements because, and I mean, being completely honest, all they do in the beginning parts of their life is just sort of like sit there and then they eat and poop and sleep. Yeah. And so you're getting to learn a lot about them and like their selves. But in the beginning, I think especially if people aren't comfortable talking to kids, they don't have a lot to go on. So what I think happens is we draw a lot of awareness to bodies. And then obviously kids are observing in the world. You know, when we were little, we all noticed that. We saw that, I mean, my daughter just did it the other day. I was slightly mortified when she did it, but we were sitting, we were talking about breasts for some reason. She's just very interested in the human body and anatomy. And, because she was learning about breastfeeding and she was very interested in how long she breastfed and all these things. And this person walked by that had very large breasts and we're sitting on the bench and she goes, whoa, those are big breasts, like loud enough that everybody could hear. And I am mortified because you don't talk about that. You don't say that. You don't comment on somebody's bodies. But by me telling her not to talk about that, what I'm saying is it's shameful to notice someone's body. And there could be something wrong with that person's body because they have bigger breasts. We don't talk about that. The same as Shh, don't say anything about that person in the wheelchair. Shh, don't talk about the fact that that person is Black and you just notice that they're different. So what we do is we sort of like subconsciously plant the idea that we don't talk about the fact that all of our bodies are different and that we look different, we develop differently, how our noses look, how our eyes look, our hair texture, our body size, all of these things, our race, our ethnic element, like what we can see, but also aspects of identity. Coupled with that, we're not really having conversations a lot of the times with how do you name and validate an emotion. I mean, most of us, I'm 35, or I'm going to be 35 in a week. I am actively doing this every day as a therapist, as someone in my own therapy practice, as a mom, and I still feel like I'm maybe 5% of the way through understanding what emotions are and how we respond to them effectively. So I think, one, that sort of naming, recognizing, but like not really talking about bodies in a way that is universally celebrating them. Like we can't talk about a fat body. We can't say that. You don't talk about that. But instead saying like, yeah, some people are in bigger bodies and some people aren't. And what would it look like to do that? Layer on top of that the lack of emotional insight that we get as kids that then gets more complex and difficult for us as we get older. And then the third layer of the shame, basically saying, if you are not at the top, or if you're feeling something that is weak, that is seen as negative, like you better hide it. I think all three of those things sort of come to a head, and we're going to grab the closest thing to us to try to figure it out. Whether that is food, to try to control that or change your body. I think a lot of us, it's not even a conscious, I'm trying to change my body. I think it's a shame-driven, I'm just trying to do whatever I can. Either I ate that pint of ice cream and whew, I got a dopamine surge and that feels good. And the next time I need relief, my brain knows it's there. Or it's I have to detox right now. I have to lose weight. I have to do all these things just to make up for these other things. But like you said, it could be alcohol, it could be cocaine, it could be technology, whatever it is. But I think it becomes a way for us to try to deal with this sort of coming together of these three things. And we don't know the effective strategies, so we turn to these other things that become maladaptive coping patterns.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So many really powerful, insightful things that you just shared there, Kyira. Like, so grateful for everything you shared. Because, I mean, you're putting words to things that, I've been learning and in my own healing journey and seeing with clients, but I haven't been able to put into words. So thank you for doing that. Mm-hmm. I love that story about your daughter. And I think that, like, that for me, even now, is such a great reminder to pay even closer attention to my language. We do this in such a habitual way where we're exactly like you said, right? We're encouraged not to talk about so many things in our society. It's not okay, right? To talk about sex. It's not okay to talk about somebody's skin color. It's not okay to talk about somebody's sexual orientation or how much they make, right? Financial shame, and like when we do that, you just hit the nail on the head, right? That's where shame comes from. We know that, like, okay, that means that they're not okay or I'm not okay and they're better than me. And like it creates this whole judgment situation, right? Where we're trying to fit in and we're trying to make sense of the world. And obviously this is a systemic problem. This is a societal problem. I mean, this is probably global, to a certain extent. And what would it be like, here I am dreaming big, right? To live in a world where we were all like understood to be unique and beautiful and different and oh cool, she looks totally different than me and that's amazing, like, and I look like this, right? And a lot of the work that I do with my clients is trying to get to that point where we can understand our uniqueness and not pit ourselves against, but it's like going against decades and hundreds of years of this like system, right? That's drilled
and genetic wiring,
totally.
Like in us.
And the ancestral trauma that's passed down with that, and that's just how it is, right? And how beautiful it would be if we could go and I've actually, I would say like the places that I've only ever got to experience this in my life have actually been at music festivals. This is the first time that I've ever, like, I went there and everybody was so weird and they loved it. And they were totally being themselves. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is so refreshing. Like everybody was being met and accepted and seen. And that's the only place I've ever, it was like living in a different universe. And I was like, what if the whole world could be like this, right? Where you could dress however you wanted and act however you wanted. And obviously being kind and respectful of other people. And, what a beautiful place that would be, right? And I know that you're working to create that, and I am too with the work that we do with our clients. And it's like one person at a time, maybe taking this bold stand, right? To be like, I'm going to be me, and I'm okay with that. And that's big work. It's not easy.
Well, and I think I was smiling as you said that because I think I've had maybe 4 or 5 clients in the last few years that have described. The one that's like most vivid to me right now is a client of mine that went to a Lizzo concert and basically just said, my life has changed. If this is what recovery could feel like, I want it so much more. Because I think there's something about, and what's interesting is there's a community there. Everybody's there. There's this bonding, there's this connection. But the connection is to something because we know music hits us in our soul. We know music changes us. It writes memories in when we experience it and what we do. So when we're there, we're not thinking about, oh my God, did I bend over in a way that I look a little fat? Did somebody see that line? Oh my gosh, does my hair look okay? Did something happen? Did I drink too much? Did I do this? Did I eat too much? We're not thinking about that stuff. We're just sort of present in that space. And I think it gives context to why, if we could really lean into more of that collectivistic aspect of creating cultural connection and interdependence without becoming dependent on each other for validation, to see that I am not better or worse than the person next to me who knows all the words of that song. I can sing all the wrong words and I still deserve to be here and can enjoy that in the music festival. And how do we shift that, I think, then in terms of, for all of us thinking, the systems are going to be there for the rest of our lifetimes. I want to believe that there's going to be a lifetime that people can live where the underbelly of our culture is not greed, power, and again, sort of patriarchal systems of oppression. That will not go away in our lifetime. It's just not how movements and changes happen. It's still too deep in our way of thinking. And even though, again, I don't want that to say, well, don't make changes, don't start having hard conversations, don't push for people to be seen. But I think the reality then being is, again, that's not something we can control wholeheartedly. I can't control some of those things, but I can control the way that I made a decision that said, we don't ever talk about our bodies being good or bad in this house. I will never give my daughter a compliment about her physical appearance. And that is very polarizing. And some parents and caregivers think that is terrible and ridiculous. I won't. I will ask her how she feels in her body. I will, every single morning when she gets up and she looks in her mirror, she says out loud, my body is beautiful. And we talk about how all bodies are beautiful. And I will push that till the end of time. Not because I think that that's going to stop her then from getting the messages that somehow her body might be less than if she is in a bigger body, or she's, biologically female, or however she identifies in terms of gender, sexual orientation, all these pieces. But to say that if at her core, I can put something in her wiring that says my body deserves to be here, my body is beautiful, it helps build that resilience against some of those things. And so think about how hard that is for her. And yet we don't give ourselves a lot of grace to say, we've been telling ourselves our bodies aren't beautiful, our bodies aren't worthy, our sense of self isn't worthy, we're not doing enough, we're not enough for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years. And yet we're punishing ourselves when in a week of taking some program or your first session with your coach or your therapist, your life isn't different. Instead of going, I have to unlearn the things that I started learning when I was a day old, a week old, 6 months old. And I need to show myself grace and compassion to say, along the way, I'm still probably going to binge on the sugar. Along the way, I still might have a few drinks of alcohol. I might have a lapse or a relapse. I might still turn to technology. I might still look at social media, even though I know it makes me feel worse about myself. And what I'm doing is trying to build the insight to understand how this came to be so that I can develop systems to rewire my thinking so that the coping mechanism doesn't feel like it's needed anymore because I'm not constantly in that state of fear.
Yeah, that's so beautifully said. That's something that I very deeply talk about as well in my programs. And when I work with clients, it's like, okay, this isn't a race, right? This is going to take some time and you're not going to be perfect at it. And even just redefining our relationship with failure, right? This is like one of the biggest things that we can do. Like so many of my clients, come into my programs, come work with me, and they're like, I'm afraid to fail again. And I'm like, what makes you a failure in this? You're doing something new. You're working on yourself. Like that is always going to be a success, right? Whether or not you end up binging tonight on sugar, right? Like we're learning something in that process. So, really redefining how we relate to ourselves, ultimately is what we're doing here. And this is big work. So how do we do it? I mean, now this is the $1 million question, Kyira, right?
Yeah.
Like, everybody listening is like, okay, I need to do this. I need to look at this stuff and this pain. And obviously this is big pain that most people, I know in my own experience as well, we have some serious protectors. We've got some serious walls up, right? Like that is like not an area we go, right? We learn that in childhood, like showing emotion, connecting with pain, no way in hell. We disconnect from that as much as possible because that is dangerous, unsafe, painful territory. So how do we begin, for somebody who's maybe never really allowed themselves to feel an emotion, especially shame? I mean, this is like the depth of the painful emotions, right? But what would you say, are some great places to start in terms of, maybe dipping their toes into this process and going inward a bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I would suggest for anybody listening to this episode, if it's resonating with them, is just to set a timer when they get done with this or whenever they can sit down for 20 minutes and just journal. Just write. No, like for me, when I journal, it's usually like bullet point lists and like a random arrow to something else and like a mind map almost. So it's not like you're, when I was little and I would feel like, well, you have to craft it perfectly of like dear diary and this and this and this because I want to go back to it and read it and it's going to be beautiful and soulful. No, like chicken scratch all the way, get down everything that's in your brain, because what we're doing right now, I call it your brain pond. When you're actively, and if there's any Stranger Things fans and they're thinking about the last season where there's like all this stuff under the water in the lake and you're like, oh, there's a portal. I don't know if you watch Stranger Things, but okay. Well, it's creepy and scary, but there's like a lake where it looks like totally fine on the top. I mean, every horror movie does this, or like horror show where like everything looks calm and it's fine, but you look underneath and there's like all these things underneath. Well, what we did today is we basically said, okay, well, you've been trying really, really hard to keep all that on the bottom so that nobody can see it when they come look at your lake, when they come look at your brain pond. They're like, wow, you really got this together. You're doing really well. And you're hiding all this stuff that you're not doing really well so nobody can tell. So good on you. Like all that stuff that shame tells us to do. Well, what we basically did is we said, well, no, everybody's feeling this regardless of how well you think you're doing. Again, I'm 10 years into recovery and I still worked out this week because I felt like I was fat. That's still very much connected to an eating disorder thing and a recovery oriented thing, and telling myself, one, why am I still associated with this sort of fat phobic language? Again, having to show myself kindness and compassion and say that is what I've been told my whole life. The fact I can recognize it now, big deal. And the fact that I'm able to say, whew, yep, realize that I was not willing to sit with that thought long enough to say you're wanting to work out because of these sort of consequential things. So realizing that all this stuff that we're kicking up now, what we're going to do is we're going to say, look, I'm going to mess it up. I'm coming in and I'm bringing it all to the surface. So the first part of just journaling is just giving your brain permission to say those thoughts deserve to be here. And there's a process in therapy called externalization. What we do with that is shame grows in silence. Shame grows when it's in your head. So as soon as you say something out loud, I mean, we've all done that. We're like, would you say that to your best friend? Would you say that to so-and-so? No. And you wouldn't even want to tell them that you're saying it to yourself because of how terrible it sounds. But we do it in our head. So if we can get it out on paper, even if nobody ever sees it, it's a way to just give some validation to your thoughts and your feelings. The second thing I think is then to kind of pause and to re-anchor on what's the actual problem. So I think a lot of the people that have maybe started listening to this podcast, a lot of the people that maybe you've seen, and like you said, even early on in your work as a coach, and like maybe the anchor point being on doing the meal planning, doing these other pieces, what ends up happening is because we're a culture built on shame, we're a culture built on quick fixes. So it's do whatever you can to fix the problem right away to get back in line of the hustle culture. That emphasis then becomes on behavior change alone rather than looking at the other three sectors. And so there's thoughts, feelings, and connections, so relationships. What we need to look at is what is the actual problem? The problem isn't that you're eating sugar, right? Like we said, the problem is something underneath. I'm feeling like I'm unrecognized, like in my relationship, and I'm not appreciated. I'm worried that maybe my relationship is over and I don't know what to do with that. I'm feeling like I have all these goals and I can't reach any of them. I'm feeling like I'm always going to be seen as less than. I feel like I'm 54 and I still haven't become an adult, like whatever those things are. Or maybe it's trauma that's been unresolved. Maybe it is being told from the time. I just listened to Viola Davis, who wrote this beautiful memoir about herself. And she was being interviewed by Brene Brown, and she was talking a lot about having to go back to these stories to realize how often she was sort of hiding that to write the story that everybody wanted to read or to hear instead of the story she wanted to tell, and how she would bring her fake self, her performance self, into the room with her wherever she went. So I think the sort of second piece is to realize Band-Aids aren't working. This isn't working. What you're doing, and the fact that you keep finding yourself here with less energy and less sense of self-love and efficacy and compassion every time, all it's doing is keeping you stuck in a cycle of shame, saying, see, you're even less than. See, you really don't have what it takes. And say, what's the actual issue, and how is my addiction helping me? How is my addiction serving me? I do not believe eating disorders are a positive thing, but I know that my eating disorder helped me get through one of the most terrible times in my entire life. Do I wish that it had come in a different way? Absolutely. But one of the things I think we do is then we sort of villainize what we go through. And then again, we make the problem us. I shouldn't have had an eating disorder. I shouldn't have developed this addiction. You're just doing the best you can. And so how do you give yourself grace to kind of recognize what it's trying to protect you from? And then ask yourself, what do you need to feel like you can go to that space and place? And maybe that's a coach, maybe that's a therapist, maybe that is, something deeper, but really thinking about what it's going to take to get to that underbelly point. And Dan, and we can put this in the show notes, Dan Harris just released a new TED Talk, and he talks about the power of not being a jerk to yourself. And one of the things that he talks about in there is basically spending his whole life trying to hide everything he felt shame around, and how all that did was bring it to the surface, and it showed up in every interaction. It showed up in all the ways that he interacted with people. And so instead to realize the only way through it is through it. You will not get stuck there. It is physiologically impossible to get stuck in an emotion. The only way that you feel it long term is you keep trying to stuff it. If that was the case, we'd get stuck in happiness. You can't. But you cannot continue to pretend like you don't have anger, sadness, resentment, fear, shame, and expect that you're going to heal. I know that's a long answer, and people are like, but you're still not giving me everything that I need to do. But I think starting with get it out, realizing that the problem is a different anchor point, and then starting to think about how do I arm myself with supports, internal and external, to start on that journey, and then give yourself permission to seek them. Again, whether it's a therapist, a coach, whatever, but realizing it might not be reasonable, feasible, and an act of self-love to try to do it on your own right now, because you are the one living that story that you're stuck in. None of us know it, so all of us can view it from a different place to help you get unstuck. We can relate to it, but it's not ours.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important, and I would have to echo that. Like, I think, in my own healing journey and what I see, we don't heal this stuff alone. We can't.
Right.
We don't. Like, and I had my therapist and medicine woman that I work with. She's like really hit home for me. Like we have to do this work in connection. We have to do this work because the trauma and where this all started was feeling disconnected. Right? Was this sense of like not being heard or seen or accepted as part of the family for all of your parts and all of this, right? That's usually where it starts. So going through those tough emotions, or dipping your toes into the shame, or doing that work, I think is really important to not be re-traumatized, going through alone. And it's actually funny, as I'm saying this, I just took myself away for a 4-night getaway by myself to just do some connecting with myself and hanging out, and also to do some grieving. Like, I'm still in this process of grieving the loss of my cat. And I realized like about 2 days in that I was like, I shouldn't be sitting here crying by myself. Like, I need someone next to me giving me a hug. Like, why am I doing this? So I'm still learning, right? That's not something that I should necessarily be going through alone. Like, that's something that is, yes, it's important to have my tools and be able to support myself, but it's so important to also have really deep support networks to hear and see us, which most of us have never had in our life, right? And I know this is the gift that you give your clients, and I do as well, is actually seeing people and hearing them, and not trying to change them, not trying to be like, suck it up, stop crying, you shouldn't be still crying, it's been 2 months, why aren't you over it? No, like this is still very a real experience for me, and I need to honor that. So I think that, I just, coming back to that reiteration, like, of getting support with this, because this really deep wound stuff is not something we can do alone. And it's actually might be more damaging to do that. Like, it might be more harming to ourselves to do that. What do you think?
And yeah, I think one of the things that you're describing is this value in differentiating between codependence and healthy interdependence, and not expecting ourselves to do everything alone, recognizing when it's helpful, because we need that for sure. But also realizing that the reason that we keep finding ourselves getting stuck here is this belief that we have to do it alone, or we have to do it in secret. You can be in this coaching group, but don't tell anybody about it. Or you can go see this therapist, but, block that on your schedule as just personal time, instead of saying, no, I'm learning and growing every day, and I don't know what to do, how to do it, all of these things. And that's why I'm seeking support. And who I am right now deserves to be in the arena, deserves to be seen, deserves to be loved. And I'm going to continue to work on these things that are making me feel stuck. But I'm not only lovable and deserving of sharing myself once I figure it out. I am worthy and lovable and deserving of sharing myself now as I go through it. And I think the more we do it, and I can say this now as somebody that's been in, my own shame recovery for quite a while, the more we say it out loud. Like, I came home the other day from dropping my daughter off at school, and one of her teachers was like just a little off, didn't say much to me when I dropped her off. And I came home and I was like, do you think that she doesn't like us anymore? Do you think she was annoyed about something that Everly did? And like, I went down a rabbit hole, and suddenly I was like, maybe they don't want us at the school anymore. Instead of realizing that all of that is connected to me not always feeling like I'm getting what I need, and then assuming everything is personal. As soon as I said it out loud, I could have my husband in this case say, that feels really painful to go there. And I don't think that's the only possibility of what happened. And I don't need him to fix it. I don't need him to solve it, but just allowing me to escape that. I think what you described is that piece of realizing that we need to be held, and that doesn't make us weak. We need to be loved, we need to be seen, and that makes us strong. And that is really where the resilience comes into play. And so if we could, instead of feeling shame the next time you pull all the stuff out of the kitchen, and you're midway through a binge, what if you just called your friend and you're like, look, I just ate 7 cupcakes and I am feeling terrible about myself, and I just want to say it out loud so that I can know that I'm loved, instead of just continuing to go down this spot.
Yeah. I think that's such a beautiful message too. And like, adding to that, a word of like wisdom, and I'm sure you would echo this too, is also to be like conscious in who we actually use as our support, right? Mm-hmm. I know for me, back when I started my journey, there was a lot of people that I was quote unquote friends with that would not have been a safe space for me to do that with, right? So paying close attention, and like, for instance, I have family members they're not my go-to. My family are not my go-to for this emotional stuff because they don't have the ability and the capacity to meet me there. So I think it's really important for everyone listening, right? As you're doing this, like you said, call a friend, make sure it's the people that you're reaching out for support with, whether it's paid support or, someone that you lovingly have in your network already. Just being really careful, right? That you're not going up with someone who's going to shut you down, right? Or not see you, or is
one of your shame triggers to begin with. That is part of where you get yourself in that story.
Right. Yeah. Right. Maybe it's your husband, right? Or maybe it's your, and there's some things to look at there. But I think it's like really important to give ourselves permission that it's okay and it's also okay if we don't have anyone right now that is that. And this is where, Kyira and I come in, right? Like, and there is so much support out there for you. And sometimes it can be really helpful to have it be someone that you're not close with too, right? I know for me, I've always had a coach and a therapist. Like, I've always got an arsenal of people supporting me because I need someone who's like that third party. They're not in it with me. They're like that third party kind of person. So
yeah.
That actually brings up another question that I had, as people are now in this space, hopefully, where you're understanding more depth to the shame and how it's showing up in these emotional pieces, how do we know what kind of support we need? Like, how do we know? I mean, there's so many things. I know I always have, different people in my life, whether it's a coach or a shaman or a therapist or, so how do we know, what the right avenue is for us, in terms of therapists, counselors, coaches? Like, there's so many beautiful humans out there, willing to support. Maybe what are the differences that you see, and how, for anyone who's sitting there right now going, how do I know what type of help that I need? Because I definitely know I need help. What type of support, should I be looking for?
Yeah, I think so. 2 things that you said that are really important. One, going back to this idea that it's great if we have some of those people built into our lives, whether it's family, friends, whatever that is. But 2, not personalizing it if we don't. And so not saying, well, I can't go to these people, or they're all going to do these things, therefore the problem is me. But again, sometimes realizing that our shame, our trauma, our stuff is connected to these people, and these maybe insecure, unhelpful attachments. And so, or recognizing too that maybe it's too high of a degree of vulnerability to expect of yourself right away. Maybe talking to your partner, talking to your best friends about something feels like the stakes are too high because you can't lose them in your life. And so maybe talking to somebody who has no stake in your life ultimately at the end of the day is helpful. I do think one of the things that I think about is, so whenever we start to do that work, so going back to those steps of what do we do next, once we get clear on what the problem is, part of the question then becomes, what's the actual goal? What do I want? Is it, and where's it derived from? So again, this idea of, why do you want to lose weight? So I'm not saying losing weight is a bad thing, but what's the intention that's motivating it? Why do you want to stop, kick your sugar addiction? What is pushing you? So really thinking about your values and motivation. And then as you think about that and sort of develop goals, what we want to do is shift into, instead of avoidant goals, like I just need to stop this problem with addiction, what's your approach goal? What do you actually want? What does a fulfilled life look like? What is the relationship you do want to have? From there, then you do sort of a need-want analysis. So what is everything that you need to get you to that point? And what is everything you want? And the reason I think those two things are really helpful is wants are great, but they're negotiable. Needs are non-negotiable. They're the things we have to have in order to get to where we want to go. So what you just described too, of like, gosh, I need somebody that I can say these things out loud to. Sometimes I want that person to be my husband, but I don't need it to be my husband. I just need to have somebody. So that helps us kind of distinguish who and what support can look like. But once you get clear on those needs, kind of surveying that against who's currently in your life that could help fill those roles, and then what it might look like to seek support in other ways. When it comes down to finding, like, is it a coach? Is it a therapist? Is it a shaman? Is it anything across the board? I think a lot more, I mean, we know this, there's something called the common factors, that it's oftentimes more helpful. And again, this comes down to depending on what someone's going through. If someone is like newly diagnosed with schizophrenia, needs to talk about med management and really figuring out how to manage that, you need somebody trained in that very specific thing with that expertise and that medical knowledge. Well, when we're talking about some of these kind of conversation pieces and moving through some of our pain, a lot of times what we find is it's actually more important to have connection that's built on trust and really kind of understanding and having that shared mutuality that's created in the relationship. That becomes more important than the actual role or title that they have. Again, not talking about those specific places that you would have to have it. So I think being open to the idea, I think some therapists are terrible. I think some coaches are terrible. I think some shamans are terrible. And I think the majority in all of those realms are wonderful. And so I think really being open to the fact that I'm not saying a coach or a therapist is better than each other. Their roles are different, sure. And learning a little bit about what can a coach do? What can a therapist do? What's within the scope of someone's ethical and kind of logistical practice is super helpful. But also just realizing that the more important thing is finding the connection. So, whenever somebody wants to come and work with me as a therapist or as a coach, I say, you should at least give yourself the space and grace and permission to meet with at least a few other people to make sure I'm the right fit. And really allowing yourself that possibility to not just sticking with me because I'm the first number that you found or you liked one interview that I gave. And so really thinking about that, I think that goes back to that piece you said too, of like, building the support that you actually want and need versus just filling the roster with people. And then when it doesn't work out, we go back to that drama triangle. Well, the problem is probably us.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said. And I've seen that as well in my own work and looking for support. Like it's so much more about who do you connect with. Right. And not just by defaulting, right? Because there's so many ways that we can get help and it can be a bit overwhelming, but it can also be, and I love that exactly what you said, right? Like make a goal of reaching out and talking to 5 people, right? Yep. And seeing which one do you actually like feel the safest with and feel connected with and obviously has the tools that can support you with what you need.
And when they're going to say the hard stuff, that you can see yourself building enough trust in them that you're not going to shut down in your shame, or when you do, you'll return back with them to try to walk through it. And I think that's the scariest and hardest part is, I don't need you to like me. I need you to trust me enough to be with you in the scariest, hardest places that you've told yourself that you can't ever bring anyone with you. And I think that's the distinction for people.
Yeah. When we're opening up to be our most vulnerable.
Right.
and can we trust the person enough to, you know, be there with us in that, right? And yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, I'm so glad that you said that. Yeah, this has been so powerful, Kyira. I want to keep talking with you for hours about this, and I'm so grateful for you coming on and opening up this conversation, because it's something that I've wanted to talk about for a while, but didn't feel like, I felt like I needed some help, and I'm so glad that you were here to share, and I've learned a lot from you today. Like, I'm going to have to sit with my journal after this in the sauna, right? We're going in the sauna.
Yes. Yes.
Actually, no journaling in the sauna. It's too wet in there, but after.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, you know, really just sitting with all of this, you know, everyone listening, you know, really giving yourself some time today while this is fresh in your mind. You've listened to this episode, you know, to do the journaling that Kyira recommends, and really just putting that out there. I couldn't agree with you more. This is something I'm in the middle of hosting a group program right now, and this came up on our last call as one of the women, like, very boldly and vulnerably obviously felt safe enough to share one of her deepest, darkest secrets. And she was crying and just sharing it, and it was just such a beautiful experience in seeing her take that step into this wounded area and be met by all the other women with love and compassion and support. And some of the other women on the call were like, holy shit, me too.
Yeah.
And I think that was like, so she was like taken back with like, what? I'm not the only one dealing with this level of pain and shame. And I think the more we can do that, and I definitely am not perfect at this, and I continue to work at being, you know, open and vulnerable and authentic myself in what I share, you know, and I'm not perfect. And the more women and the more of us that do that, you know, human beings that do that, the more it gives us this like permission, right? Other people are like, oh, she's doing that, right? She's being honest. I can be honest and be okay, right? I think this might be one of the ways through it, you know, if my dream, you know, in my dream world is like, the more of us, is kind of like this waterfall effect. The more of us that really do step up, like I know you're doing, Kyira, on even just this conversation that we're having, right? And being like, here's my wounds, like, here's the truth. And I know you have wounds too. You might be hiding it, right? You look at people on Instagram and, you know, all these people that look like they got their stuff together, and it's just it's not true. None of us have it figured out, by the way. And we're working on it, and that's okay.
There's a term in AA that's called terminal uniqueness, and there's different ways that they talk about it in there, but there's this concept around, my story's too out there, too intense. My pain is too much. It's different than everybody else. You couldn't possibly understand. But there's also this belief of like, I'm too messed up. I'm beyond help. There's something about me that is separate, that it's a sort of outcast idea. And sometimes it's a form of deflection and avoidance, and sometimes it is the true epitome of shame. And I think one of the things that's most important is to realize that, and it's talked about in the book Burnout by Emily and Amelia Nagoski. It's a beautiful book that talks about burnout, and it really addresses a lot of what we started to mention around like the patriarchy and different aspects of intersecting identities and how that affects us. But they talk about how one of the things we've lost along the way as we've gotten sort of more logical and higher functioning sort of cognitively is that we're not cognitive beings that occasionally feel. We're emotional beings that have thought and have developed the power for complex thought. And so I think that aspect of feeling like, well, you're alone in an emotion is the crux of shame, when the thing that bonds us is the emotions, and in particular the painful ones. We're all going to feel grief, we're all going to feel shame, we're all going to feel, you know, all these intense, terrible things. And if we can realize, oh, I'm not the dumb one asking a question in class. Everybody had this question. I'm not the dumb one who feels stupid or feels like I couldn't do this thing that everybody else could, or doesn't have my life together, or looks at, in my case, like all the like Pinterest boards and the parenting people on social media. They're like, look, you can just do this. Everything's going to be amazing. And I'm like, that's not how the world works. And if we can just call that out and say, we're all chasing something and we have to have goals, and I get it. And at the end of this, the thing that bonds all of us is the fact that we are learning to move through this emotional experience that is life. And the more we say it out loud, the more we take away shame's opportunity to make us feel like we're the problem. And instead, again, we come back to that sort of healthy interdependence of realizing that that is the thing that brings us together.
Yeah. We all have this. This is not and like you said earlier, right? Some people are just really great at hiding it.
Yeah.
Right? And it's not working, right?
Right,
It's coming out somewhere. It is not working. I mean, look at the state of our world. I mean, just look. It is not working, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So this has been so great, Kyira. Thank you so much for coming on today. And if people want to reach out, find more about what you do, where can they find you online?
Yeah, so I would say best place to go is my website, adversityrising.com. You can find links there to check out different podcasts I've guested on, like this wonderful one. Check out my YouTube channel. They can see all the different programs and things that I do. And I think the best way to then connect with me is just hit that connect button and send me an email. I love to just actually have a conversation and figure out what does support look like for you, whether that's here's a couple blog posts that help, or here's the next book club I'm doing, or here's this. But yeah, I think everything I do is there, and I would just rather people, if they find a connection point, want to talk, send me that email, kind of step past the shame of feeling like she doesn't mean me. She doesn't want to do that. No, just say, hey, this is what's sitting with me, and this is what I'd like to do next. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Please,
of course,
everybody, if you resonate with Kyira and everything that she shared in her story, please reach out. I'll make sure the links are all below the show notes. So everybody can grab them. And also that TED Talk you talked about earlier, I jotted that down, so I'll find that and put the link below the show notes too. And this has been so powerful, like I said, for me, and I know for everybody listening, so please, if you're listening to this, reach out, right? Reach out to somebody, whether it's Kyira or me or someone that you already, know and trust, and just have this conversation. Maybe next time you get together with your best friend, even just talk about it. Like, what shame is showing up for you? We can have like a fun, like shame sharing circle, and like put it out there on the table, because it's so powerful when we take away so much of its power, when we speak our fears, when we speak about our shame, when we speak about these things, right, that are really deeply ingrained in all of us. So I appreciate that reminder for me too, Kyira, and the language that we use. And I know I'm going to be paying more attention in my life, to the language and the things that are showing up for me as I continue my shame journey as well. So really appreciate it. And everybody listening, so grateful for you tuning in and being here with us. And we'll look forward to having you back on the show soon, Kyira.
Oh, yay.
Yes. All right. Thanks, everyone. And we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. If you're loving what we talked about today, please remember to subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with someone you love. And if you're ready to dive deeper into discovering your root causes and patterns that are keeping you hooked on sugar, be sure to check out our brand new free workshop series that will help you kick emotional eating for good. Find the link to download this free series and other amazing resources in the show notes below.